Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Reaction Show. My name is Andrew Velez, and my co-host, Mr. Joel Dels. We are here before Week 12 of the NFL fantasy football season with our starts and sits of the week. We're here before Thursday Night Football. Going to be an amazing game. Can't wait. One of the games of the year, Steelers versus the Browns, in what apparently is looking to be a snowy, windy, disgusting day in beautiful Cleveland, Ohio. That being said, before we get into any fantasy football, Mr. Dells, how you doing tonight, sir?
This is playoff football we're getting tonight, Drew. This is what everyone talks about when the good old days in the 60s and 70s and the Steelers and the snow and the wind. I can't wait. This is playoff time too for our main league. You got the bye this year. I am in a matchup with Vaughn, 2-week matchup. Got David and Njoku going tonight, and I've been going back and forth with Chris Boswell because tough kicker situation because the wind is terrible, but I don't know, it's too just elite. I feel like I can't him. I don't got anything to I don't have anyone to pick him up, or anyone to replace him with, I should say. So I think I'm trusting Chris Boswell out there, even in the bad conditions. He's been too much of a stud to sit.
I will say I understand starting in Njoku. Can't say that I'm anticipating a lot. Yep, I agree. I think you have Breece Hall on bye. And who else do you have on bye?
Yeah, Breece and Brian Thomas.
Okay, Brian Thomas at this point, although he did put double digits last week, that kind of surprised me.
Again. Yeah, he was the last couple of weeks. I feel like the ribs. I mean, obviously, having Mac Jones doesn't help, but the rib injury I felt like played more into it. But last week he looked more healthy, more involved.
Yeah, thankfully I don't have to stress. 2 weeks chilling. Devonta Smith, he got injured. He has a hamstring injury. Hasn't practiced in back-to-back days. I don't have to worry about that for 2 weeks. Honestly, there's a part of me. Hey, sit down. Take this week. If you want to take off next week too, that's cool with me. Let's get right. Let's get healthy for when I really need you to get going. But with that being said, Mr. Dels, let's get right into it. Let's get into our starts and sits of the week. Starting off with the starts. Start us off with the quarterback position. Who is your start of the week at the QB?
You know I'm going with my guy, one of my favorite players in this league, Bo Nix, going up against the Las Vegas Raiders this week. He was your start of the week last week, trying to get some magic again this week. Quarterback 7 on the year. Bo Nix has been great all season long, but really over this last month has been his best brand in football. 10 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, has 280 or more passing yards in 2 of those 4 games.
Talk that mess, Dels.
He's been playing well, and we saw him play against Vegas earlier in the season. This was, again, when he wasn't playing maybe the best football like he is now. Had 206 yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 passing, 1 rushing. Since week 5, he has just 1 finish outside the top 15 and 4 finishes within the top 10. He's been phenomenal. This matchup against Vegas is also phenomenal. They allowed the 7th most points to the quarterback position. Bo Nix has been great if you were able to pick him up off of waiver wires, keeping him in your lineup this week.
That's that stuff that got me feeling good. Bo mother frickin' Nix, one of the fantasy goats. Who would have thought? And I love the start of the week. I love the vote of confidence in him because you've had your ups and your downs with Bo Nix, but I'm glad to see you're starting to.
Never been all the way in, never been all the way out.
So what are we? Are we still not all the way in?
We're gaining information.
And you're on my list still. That being said, let me move on to my quarterback start of the week. One of my guys. I'm not fully allowed to say that, but he is. Mr. Justin Herbert going up against the Baltimore Ravens. In the last 4 weeks, Justin Herbert's been back as a fantasy option. Last 4 weeks, he's had at least 20 fantasy points, kind of rounded in a couple of those. It was like 19.5, 19.6. So I gave him the little bump up. He's been a top 10 quarterback 3 of the last 4 weeks as well. He has the highest passer rating of his NFL career this year of any other year. That was something that was interesting to me. No, he does have a 5,000-yard passing season. He has a 30 passing touchdown season, multiple. He's one of them ones. But this season, he's been the most efficient that he's been with the ball in his hands and going up against the defense that allows the 3rd most points to fantasy quarterbacks in the Baltimore Ravens. We tend to do this a lot. We really target the Ravens. We target the Raiders. We target all these bad teams, the Jaguars. But that's what you have to do, especially when Justin Herbert's on a heater. Send it. That's the start of the week.
Yeah, and the Chargers are top 5 in pass rate over expectation this season. To start the year, they were super low because it was just J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards for a lot of it, but they've completely turned around the offense, and as they should, you have Justin Herbert. The running back position, though, going with Brian Robinson, playing the Dallas Cowboys this week. It's been a tough stretch for Robinson since week 5. He's been battling injuries. He's been in and out of the lineup. And even when he's in the lineup, he's had games where he's played less than 50% of snaps, not looking 100% like the Brian Robinson we saw in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season. But he's as healthy as he's been since the start of the season. He played 53% of snaps last week against Philly. That was his most since week 4. He's playing in back-to-back games for the first time since week 8. And he's completely off the injury report right now. No limited, no full. Like, he is not even on that list when you go and look at their website. So he has been as healthy as he's been in several weeks at this point. What we saw last week with Joe Mixon going up against the Dallas Cowboys, Brian Robinson is not Joe Mixon, but Joe Mixon ate those boys apart. We're talking about 140 total yards, 3 touchdowns, and that's been the story all season long with the Dallas Cowboys. It's not Joe Mixon. It does not matter what running back has been back there for the opponent. They're allowing the second most points to opposing running backs. So Brian Robinson's in your lineup this week, and if you're dealing with buys, I think Austin Eckler's in your lineup too.
I was going to say, I contemplated making Austin Eckler my start of the week. That's how bad this Cowboys rush defense is. And regardless, Austin Eckler has been pretty fantasy reliable over these last few weeks while Brian Robinson's been coming back from injury. But even last week, we saw him have double-digit fantasy points. He's just been a reliable receiving option for Jaden. Now, my running back start of the week, it's time. We've been waiting on a breakout game. We thought that it'd maybe be last week going up against Seattle. He's had double-digit fantasy points in both of the weeks that he's been back. The snap percentage is exactly what we needed, but we haven't seen Christian McCaffrey have a Christian McCaffrey type of game. And going up against the Green Bay Packers, they sit middle of the pack in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position, but those running backs aren't Christian McCaffrey. And in an ugly game right now, you see the images of Green Bay. It's snowing. It's going to be cold. It's going to be wet. I'm fully anticipating the game plan to be centered around Christian McCaffrey, and for all the managers that have been waiting and they wasted the number 1, number 2 overall draft pick, this is the week I see it fully that he goes and he has that top spot of the RB1. I just see it perfectly where the game plan's completely centered around him, but this is the week where he finally breaks out and shows who he is.
A bit worried about Brock Purdy this week. I don't know if you
I
saw
am.
Yeah, they pushed back the normal quarterback interview. It's usually Thursday. It's Friday now. There was reports that he was throwing at practice and then he was shut down and off to the side with trainers. So, I mean, there's a chance that Brock Purdy misses this game. But even still, it's CMC. He's in your lineup. Wide receiver position, we've been talking about this stretch for a while. Marvin Harrison. It's time for him to really show out and show why he was the first wide receiver taken in this draft.
Love it.
Fantasy receivers have had their way all season long against Seattle, this is who Marvin's playing this week. They allowed the 9th most points to the position. But what's really interesting is the Seahawks use press coverage at the 5th highest rate in the league, around 71-72%. Number 1 in fantasy points per route run against press is Nico Collins. Number 2 in fantasy points per route run versus press is Marvin Harrison Jr. He has been one of the best wide receivers against press coverage in the NFL this year. And he was starting to, kind of rev it up before the bye week. He had over 100 yards against Miami in week 8. Against the Jets right before the bye week, had 5 catches, 54 yards, and a touchdown. And if the Jets were competitive in that game, probably would have been closer to 100 yards. But of course, they were not big and didn't really have to throw as much. Marvin Harrison is in your lineup this week. And probably from now until the rest of the season, he is locked in because the schedule looks beautiful.
Marvin was going to be my start of the week, but I felt, you know what? Let's go with the stack with Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey. Now, the interesting here is Ladd McConkey did not practice today with what I believe was a shoulder injury. And if that's the case, I still feel confident with QJ, but not as confident as I do about Ladd McConkey in this matchup. Now, the Baltimore Ravens, they allowed the most points to fantasy wide receivers. And over the last 4 weeks, you still have Ladd McConkey averaging 88 yards a game. Last week versus the Bengals, 9 targets, 6 catches, 123 yards. Over these last 4 games, he ranks 4th in against zone with an 86.3 grade. He ranks 8th against man with an 86.9% grade. In general, an 87.5 receiving grade. He has 350 yards. That ranks 6th. He has 17 first downs, which ties him for 6th, and 2.99 yards per route run versus zone. That ties 5th as well. He has just an average of 2.99 yards per route run. That ranks 7th over these last 4 weeks. Ladd McConkey and Justin Herbert are starting to figure it out. It sucks that he did pick up this injury. I still anticipate that he does play, but if he does play, we're looking at what could be one of the best finishes on the week.
Yeah, he's a star. He's breaking out. That's why my tight end star of the week is going to be Will Disley going up against the Baltimore Ravens. We're staying in the Disley Flames. Last week, he was your star of the week, coming off one of his best games of the season. 4 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown. If you look over the last 5 weeks, he has 6 or more targets in 4 of those games. And you just mentioned it. Baltimore against wide receivers, not great. Against tight ends, they're a little bit better. 10th best in the league, not absolute worst. Or excuse me, 10th worst, I should say, allowing the 10th most points. But it doesn't matter who's going up against Baltimore. Their secondary, their linebackers have had trouble covering pass catchers all season long. Will Disley and Justin Herbert have also been gaining a connection, as well as Ladd McConkey there. We've seen over these last weeks, Justin Herbert is passing the ball more. He's relevant for fantasy football. He's making these receivers relevant too. You talked about Ladd McConkey. I'm talking about Will Disley. I think Quentin Johnston's in that mix too.
Yeah, QJ definitely is one of those that I feel more than confident this week. Strong flex. If bye weeks got you down, he can be your second wide receiver this week. I really love the matchup versus the Baltimore Ravens. Now, my tight end start of the week, Dallas Goedert versus the Los Angeles Rams. Right now, the Rams allow the 6th most points to the tight end position. And since coming back from injury in PPR leagues, Goddard still has double-digit points in both of the games since he's returned. Now, what really allows me to feel confident in Dallas is we don't have Smitty. It looks as if Smitty may not suit up this week, as he has missed back-to-back days of practice. You still give him that respect and maybe that chance to practice on Friday. Maybe that leads him to play on Sunday. He's not a vet, but obviously he's been in the league a little bit of time, and he has played through these last couple of weeks with this hamstring injury. But we saw when AJ was down, Goddard got an uptick in opportunity. When Smitty obviously was injured with the concussion, we still saw Dallas Goddard get there. But then, of course, he gets injured. He misses a great amount of time, but coming back immediately doesn't look like he's missed a beat, at least fantasy-wise. But in this matchup versus the Rams, I really like Goddard.
Move on to the sits of the week. Quarterback position. Sam Darnold going up against the Chicago Bears is not someone I'm looking to play. Bears defense has been sensational this season. They are the toughest matchup for all quarterbacks. Some highlights on their season so far. They held Kyler Murray to 4 fantasy points. They held Matt Stafford to 4 fantasy points. Anthony Richardson to 4 fantasy points. And Drake May to 13 fantasy points, which I believe was his worst outing of the season so far. They've allowed really just one quarterback to have a big game against them. That was Jaden Daniels, who had nearly 400 total yards back in week 8. But on the season, they've had more interceptions than passing touchdowns allowed, and they're giving up just 213 passing yards per game. This matchup for Sam Darnold is not great. He had a bit of a bounce back week last week against Tennessee in a somewhat tough matchup. But we saw the week before going up against Jacksonville on the road. Looked like an absolute gimme. I think he was actually my star of the week that week. Seemed like that was a position for Darnold to be a top 10, top 5 quarterback. Wasn't able to come through. So Sam hasn't been the most consistent quarterback for fantasy after a super hot start. But this matchup against Chicago, in Chicago, something I'm looking to stay away from.
Now, my guy is also one of the quarterbacks that you mentioned who struggled against Chicago. My sit of the week is going to be Mr. Matthew Stafford. Now, I love Matthew Stafford. I wouldn't say like a brother, but like a family relative, honestly. Like, he's just one of those guys that I love his game, and I love everything that he brings to the football community. That being said, coming off a week where he was a top 5 fantasy finishes with 28 fantasy points, going up against the Philadelphia Eagles, who right now have been one of the best defenses against fantasy QBs. Right now, they allow the 4th fewest points. I don't love this matchup. And I understand that since we've seen Puka come back, cut back in the lineup, he's been pretty solid as a fantasy option. In 3 of the last 4 weeks, he's finished at least as a top 3 guy. In 2 of those games, he's been a top 5 fantasy quarterback. But the Philadelphia Eagles simply are playing at too high of a level. One of the best pass defenses, one of the best rush defenses, one of the better at getting to the quarterback as well. And in a situation where Matthew Stafford's offensive line, we saw it versus the Miami Dolphins. If you can get pressure on Matthew Stafford, that's when we really see this offense struggle. And that is the game where he did not finish as a top 13 guy, where he was the 20th quarterback, and he did finish with under 11 fantasy points. So with that being said, Matthew Stafford, love him, but not this week.
Yeah, Stafford was definitely one of the names I was looking at too. At the running back position, though, Tony Pollard going up against the Houston Texans. Been hating on Tony Pollard these last couple of weeks. Going to continue to hate on Tony Pollard at least for one more week. When you look at these last couple of games, right, these last 2 weeks, he has just 12 fantasy points combined. He hasn't had more than 10 carries, a touchdown, or 45 rushing yards going up against these opponents. And it's been some tough opponents. He played the Chargers. He played the Vikings. Both of those teams are top 5, top 6 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position. But the Texans are right there. They're the 6th toughest opponents, 6th toughest matchup for opposing running backs. After this week, though, as we've talked about last week and maybe even the week prior, I feel like Pollard might be 3 weeks in a row where I have him as my sit of the week. The schedule really lightens up. He got Jacksonville a couple of times. He has Washington, who hasn't been great against running backs. But it's one more week with Tony Pollard on the bench. After that, I feel like he's going to get back more into a workhorse role where he can be efficient. He gets some goal line touches. But until then, I'm not trusting this offense. And I hate this matchup going up against the Texans.
My running back sit of the week is another one of my guys, our guy, I should say, and J.K. Dobbins. Now, J.K. last week had 11 carries, but made the most of his opportunity, averaged 5.1 a carry, got into the end zone twice. And like we mentioned on the studs, that second touchdown, he didn't need to give fantasy managers, but he did because he loves us. In the last 2 of the 3 weeks, we've seen him average over 5 a carry, 5.1 versus Cincinnati, and then 6.1 versus Cleveland. Versus Tennessee, didn't have his most efficient game, 15 carries for 50 yards, 3.3 a carry. But one of the things that I do realize that is cutting into his workload, one, he's going up against the Ravens, and that's the first and foremost the main reason why J.K. Dobbins is my sit of the week. They allowed the third fewest fantasy points to running backs. They're one of the best rush defenses in football, but also their passing defense is so weak that I'm anticipating it's a huge Justin Herbert and wide receivers type game. You already have Will Dissly as one of your starts of the week. I have Ladd McConkey. I would have made QJ one of my starts of the week. But in this matchup where we've seen J.K. Dobbins be a little inconsistent as a rusher, as an efficient rusher, but really we know the opportunity is going to be there. But you have the 5.1 and the 6.1, but in between that, you have to go back all the way to week 2 to find an efficient game for J.K. Dobbins. 3.3, 3.4, 2.9, 3.8, 2.3, 2.9. Really hasn't been overly efficient for him. He just has a nose for the end zone. He is their goal line back. And in this matchup, I'm not sure if we're really going to see much of that. And last week we saw his limited opportunity, and that was a game script where they should have been running the ball a lot more. So for that reason, J.K. Dobbins, I'm going to have him ride the bench this week.
Yeah, Baltimore is not the best matchup either. They're terrible against the pass, but they are pretty damn good against the run. Wide receiver position, we're doing the anti-stack. Sam Darnold, Jordan Addison going up against the Chicago Bears. Addison is coming off arguably his best game of the season, so I want to give him credit there. 8 targets was the most he's had all year, 61 yards, third most of the season, scored a touchdown as well. But it's a really tough matchup going against Chicago, right? When we talk about Sam Darnold and how great they've been against quarterbacks, they're probably also pretty damn good against wide receivers, and the same goes for this matchup against Chicago. They're allowing the 5th fewest points to opposing wide receivers. And in the 2 games Addison played last season against Chicago, and again, it's not exactly apples to apples here, different defenses, but one of those matchups was in the beginning of the year when Chicago's defense wasn't as great as it is in the second half of last year, and really all of this season. He combined for just 67 yards. So we're talking about 30, 35 yards per game. Not something that I'm looking to start. A few other flex-worthy options that I think I would start over Jordan Addison this week. We talked about Quinn Johnson going up against Baltimore. I would start him. Calvin Ridley going up against the Houston Texans week in and week out. He's earning targets, and Houston's secondary is something you can take advantage of. And then Roma Dunze going up against the Minnesota in this same matchup. It's coming off a 10-target game. I feel like this new offensive coordinator is using him more in the offense. 10 targets, I think it's the second or third most he's had all season long. So Jordan Addison is kind of that weekly flex option that a lot of managers are looking for, but not in this matchup against the Bears.
My wide receiver sit of the week, Jacoby Myers versus the Denver Broncos. Now, first and foremost, the obvious part of that, you have to line up against Pat Surtain. And if it's not Pat Surtain, Jaquan McMillan. And if not Jaquan McMillan, Riley Moss. AKA, we have the best secondary in football. We allow the fewest points to fantasy wide receivers. Now, I say this to highlight Jacoby Myers because he's been pretty fantasy relevant over these last few weeks since Devontae Adams has been gone. And really, as he's been the number one option, of course, we know that is Brock, but regardless, we saw versus Kansas City, he had 17 fantasy points. This is all in PPR leagues. And then the week after that versus Cincinnati, about 19 fantasy points. This past week, when you line up against Miami, obviously it was a big Brock Bowers game. Regardless, 8.8 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 catches, just did not make the most of his opportunities, 28 yards. I look at this matchup versus the Denver Broncos and understand he's seeing a lot of volume here. He has an average of around 9 targets over these last few weeks. I still don't like the matchup to the point where I don't want Jacoby Myers. I would rather a QJ. I would rather all the guys that you listed. That it's just not a option that I'm looking towards, because although he did play well in the matchup against us early on in the season, had 13 fantasy points, 6 catches for 72 yards on 9 targets, the volume is going to be there. But I believe the pressure that we're going to get on Gardner Minshew or going to be their quarterback, whether it's Gardner, whether Aiden O'Connell comes in at some point in time during the game. And I know for whatever reason, when the Broncos match up against the Las Vegas Raiders, we kind of make it difficult on ourselves, at least early on in matchups. And of course, prior to the win this year, we were 0-8 against them in our last 8 matchups. Anything can happen, but I'm pretty confident this year with what our defense has been able to do that we can go and we can shut down this offense. Maybe not Brock, though.
Yeah, no, Brock Bowers probably going to get his, but yeah, Jacoby Myers was another player. Anytime you're going up against Denver, that's the first team I'm looking at. It's like, okay, who's the wide receiver one? Is he elite? Yes. Okay. Now said the week. Is he okay? All right. Said the week.
That's a fact. That is essentially my thought process there. But Mr. Dels, let's get into some injuries. Maybe a little scattered this week, but regardless, let's get into it. You mentioned Brock Purdy did have the shoulder injury. It seemed as if mid-practice he kind of shut himself down. He's listed as day-to-day with this right shoulder injury. Not great news, truthfully, but there's part of me that still believes he will be good to go. You need this one, honestly. It's getting into desperation mode, especially after losing to the Seattle Seahawks. I think he will be good to go. That also is partnered with George Kittle. He himself came out and said that he's going to be good to go. He did miss this past week with the hamstring injury, but regardless, I'm going to give George Kittle the pass that he will be playing. Also, making his debut, your guy, Jonathan Brooks. I actually don't know if that's your guy, but I'm just going to call him your guy. Jonathan Brooks, he was questionable. I believe that he's listed as questionable, but all the reports are leaning towards him making his debut versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Not the best team to make your debut against, as the Kansas City Chiefs are arguably the best rush defense in football where we currently stand. They've been fantastic, but obviously, nevertheless, great to see the kid make his debut. Now we have David Njoku. The guy that you're starting this week, he's going to be playing, so don't worry about that. That game will already have passed. We have Jake Ferguson with the concussion that he suffered on Monday night. With concussions, you never know how it's going to be, but regardless, even if he does suit up, I don't like Jake Ferguson because of Cooper Rush, because of that whole offensive situation. That is not something I like. However, something to note, Schoonmaker, while he was out, did have 6 catches for 56 yards. So if you're really desperate at tight end going up against the Commanders, maybe Luke Schoonmaker isn't the worst option. You have DeAndre Swift that is questionable coming into this game with the groin. He did not practice on Wednesday. Not sure about his injury status, whether or not he did practice. Joel, if you could look that up for me.
He was limited.
Okay, which huge news. If he's limited, I'm assuming that he is good to go. Mike Evans versus Mike Evans for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, obviously going to be questionable coming into this game with the hamstring injury. Hasn't played these last few weeks, but it's looking as if he is ready to go. Has been practicing this week in limited fashion. Mike Evans, obviously, if he's playing, you fire him up, especially going up against the New York Football Giants, who sneakily Drew Phillips has been one of the better cornerbacks in football this year. But regardless, Mike Evans around the red zone, you know that's Baker Mayfield's go-to option. So I really anticipate Mike Evans to be a great part of the offense. Sam Laporta practiced in full, had the shoulder injury. He'll be good to go. You have Calvin Ridley, who is questionable with an illness, did miss practice on Wednesday, but it looks as if he'll be back at practice today. He was back at practice today, and he will be good to go this upcoming Sunday. Now, we rarely give kicker news, but Austin Sabert has been one of the best kickers in football. He's questionable with the hip. He's missed the last couple of weeks. He was limited in practice these 2 days on Wednesday and Thursday. I hope that means that he will play. Limited usually means that you're good to go, but with his situation being held out for the last 2 weeks, to me, that's a TBD. And the last one, Jordan Addison, your sit of the week. He's questionable with a leg injury. Did have cramps, but I think that won't interrupt him too much. He'll be good to go this upcoming week. But that's going to do it for our injury put in Dels, unless you have anything else to add.
That's all I got. Yeah, sorry. No questions this week. Forgot to tweet it out. Next week, we're back.
Not the worst thing, but quick episode. That's going to do it from us over here at the Fantasy Reaction Show. We'll do you guys the favor. If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comment section down below. Reach out to either one of us at Handrew5As, at Joel Dels on Twitter. You can reach out to us with your questions. We will answer all of them. If you made it this far in the video, thank you very much. That's very appreciated. But of course, if you could leave a like on this video, that helps us out a lot. If you're not subscribed to the channel, lock in. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you know when we drop our content like we did tonight. When the podcast, Pick a Side podcast drops, when Riv Academy drops, rumor has it, there's an episode being recorded as we speak. The Weekly Blitz drops every Monday. And tune into the Objectively Biased podcast on their channel. They talk basketball. It seems as if they're talking a little bit of football as well. Love that for the guys as well. That being said, we appreciate you guys coming by and tuning in with us, and we will see you guys next time.